Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Rocío. I'm a postdoctoral researcher within the project U4, Recognition as a Unit of Excellence. And I'm going to talk about some of the studies I did during my research career. I'm going to talk about mostly about farmland birds in a congress of forest system, but I hope you enjoy it. It's not working, sorry. Okay, that's right. So I'm a biologist, and I did my PhD in ecology at Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. After that, I have been a postdoctoral researcher in 3 Spanish universities, and I have also worked as a GIS assistant. So let's start with the research I did as a PhD student. In my PhD thesis, I investigated the role of biotic interactions in the ecology of the little bustard. This one, oops, sorry, this one. This is a highly threatened farmland bird, and we were interested on how this relationship have implications for the conservation of this species. Well, my group was interested in how males and females interact, but also on the interactions established with the great bustard. This is a closely related species that coexists with the little bustard in agricultural landscapes. And finally, we also studied the effects of human disturbances on the little bustard's ecology. Well, the little bustard is a species in which males aggregate to perform the sexual display. Males defend territories, and females visit these male displaying areas just to reproduce, because males are not involved in parental care. Despite the lack of male parental care, we wanted to know if females with offspring tend to remain within the proximities of these male displaying areas. And to do so, we first delimited male displaying areas using spatial analysis, and we measured several spatial metrics that reveal how females with offspring tend to remain closer within these male displaying areas. And this is important for the conservation of this species, because the protection of male displaying areas should be also protecting important resources for females with chicks. Then, to investigate the interactions established between the little and the great bustard, well, the great bustard is the bigger one, obviously, we used 3 different approaches. First, we applied a machine learning technique called Maxent that uses environmental information and presence locations of the species of interest to determine how the environmental features affect the spatial distribution of the species. And this method also generates habitat suitability maps like the one in the picture. The second approach was rooted on evolutionary theory, according to which individuals use habitats in a density-dependent manner, such as the expected fitness is equalized in all occupied habitats. So by studying densities in different habitats, we can unveil the competitive interactions. The third approach was based on ecological niche theory. So coexisting species that compete for resources should segregate their ecological niches to avoid the negative effects of competition. In our study, we built kernel density estimators that have like this kind of shape to build the ecological niches of these bustard species using habitat data. And we study how the amplitude and the position of these niches change with bird densities. And what we found is that these 2 species compete for habitat, with the little bustard being the subordinate competitor and the great bustard the dominant one. Increased densities of great bustard force the smaller little bustard to narrow its ecological needs and to restrict the habitat use to fallow land in agricultural areas, while the great bustard remain unaffected by the presence of the little bustard. And finally, we study how the effects of hunting on the physiological stress response of the little bustard, because in many landscapes where the little bustard occupies, they are also frequently used by hunters. So we collected little bustard feces from large wintering flocks on the field, and then we quantify hormones on the laboratory. And the results show that during weekends, when hunting activity occurs here in Spain, birds had higher levels of stress hormones, suggesting the need to regulate hunting, at least in those areas most important for the conservation of these species, whose populations have severely declined by 50% on just a decade, which is too much. And Spain holds most of the European population, so we have a very important role in the conservation of these species at the European level. Then, after finishing my PhD, I kept working on farmland ecosystems. I used different approaches to study the movement ecology and year-round habitat use of another endangered farmland bird, the pintail sandgrouse, this very beautiful bird with very colorful. And what we learned from these studies is that the key relevance of maintaining semi-natural habitats within agricultural areas is something that is we are losing on the traditional way of practicing agriculture. And well, we must recover these semi-natural areas for the protection of these species. I have also the opportunity to work with researchers from the National Museum of Natural Science to study also the effectiveness of conservation measures of the Common Agricultural Policy to protect farmland birds. In particular, how these conservation measures affect the taxonomic and functional response of the bird community. And what we found in this study is that the increasing the proportion of conservation measures that enhance food for these birds result in positive effects on the bird richness, whereas balancing food and shelter measures cause an increase in bird abundance. However, we observe differences in the effects for the functional diversity. For example, there was a positive effect of increasing food on the functional diversity of diet plasticity, which is very coherent. But the effects was much more complex for the other traits, suggested that conservation measures that are applied at the field scale level can have positive benefits at the landscape level. Then, as a GIS assistant, I participated in a project funded by Fundación Biodiversidad, and in this project we aim at identifying hotspots of reptile biodiversity within the Iberian Peninsula and assess their degree of vulnerability to global change. To do so, we first identify the UTM squares that hide the highest species richness of reptiles, and then we evaluate temporal variation in primary productivity. We use a vegetation index obtained from satellite remote sensing images to quantify variation in primary productivity over the last 20 years. And we further explore how this temporal variation in primary productivity was affected by changes in climatic conditions and land uses. And now, as a postdoc in the U4, I say temporarily goodbye to farmland birds and hello to large ungulates, which are species linked to forest, but they also use farmland areas to feed. In the last decades, there has been an important increase in the population size of wild boars and deers, which are causing several impacts on human interest, such as damage to crop production and forestry, and also increased the number of traffic accidents, as can be seen here in the graph. So we are now studying the temporal and spatial patterns of these traffic accidents caused by these species. And we are also interested on the role of hunting on the population dynamics. So we think that the results of this study will be very useful for the administrations to mitigate the negative impacts of these overabundant species and to eventually implement management actions. So that's all. Thank you very much.